Hey, this is Digital by Computing. Today we're going through the differences between Windows and Mac computers in a business. So you may be part of a business, you may be part of an IT team, or may have decisions around what computers you want to have in your business. So we're going to go through the differences between Windows and Macs and which ones may benefit you and your business better. So what you need to consider is, what is the primary use of the computer going to be? Is it going to be primarily for Word documents, for Excel, spreadsheets, those sort of things? Is it going to be for gaming? Is it going to be for video, photo editing? What sort of stuff is going to be done on the computer? Based on that, you'll make the decision whether to go Windows or Mac. You probably already know that Macs generally are more expensive. So you've got to keep that in consideration. If you're if you're going to be using it for, say, simple tasks, if you're going to just be doing some word editing, some spreadsheets, those sort of things, and you've got cost as a reason to what computer to buy, you may want to go down the Windows route, get a PC versus getting a Mac if you want to do a bit more fancy stuff, right? So really try to determine firstly what you're going to be using the computer for. If you're going to be doing things like photo editing, things like video editing, the Mac suite of software is, in my opinion, a lot better. A lot of the stuff comes bundled with the Mac and can do a lot of the tasks that a Windows machine may not be as good at. So first thing, determine what you're going to be using it for. That will sort of determine where you want to go and which purchase you want to go for. The big thing is obviously the price. So if you are going to be purchasing more than one computer, the price is a big factor. Generally, you'll find that the Macs, like the MacBook Pros, the laptop ranges, the desktop ranges, the iMacs, the Mac Pros, those sort of things, are generally more expensive than the Windows PC counterparts. So you've got your PCs, you've got your Dells, your HPs, your Lenovo's, those sort of things are generally going to be cheaper than your Macs. A lot of that has to do with the parts that they're using. The parts of a Macs go for very, very good slick style, that sort of thing. They're using full aluminium bodies, so the titanium bodies, they're very light. They look really flashy, but you're also going to be paying for that as well. While a PC, it's not going to be as good quality in certain things. Now, the parts inside, you can get generally the same sort of parts, right? Earlier versions of Macs used to have different internal components, right? But newer Macs are using the same sort of processors, the same sort of RAM, same graphics cards, those sort of things as a PC, all right? So you're not going to be concerned in terms of the specs of the computers, because you're generally going to find they're about the same nowadays, right? One thing you do have to consider though is Apple makes the hardware and they make the software, okay? So you're buying a Mac computer that is made by Apple, like the shell, the body, the manufacturing, the building of the machines, all those sort of things are done by Apple. And on top of that, the software, the Mac operating system that is running on top of that, is also made by Apple. So you're going to have a lot better compatibility. Things like drivers, those sort of things are going to work a lot more seamlessly. While on the Windows PC front, you've got a Dell computer, for example. You're going to buy a Dell laptop and you're going to install Windows on it, which is made by Microsoft. So you've got two different companies trying to create products to try to work with each other. Same thing, you get a HP, you get a Lenovo, you get a Toshiba. You're running Windows software onto it. You could also run obviously other things like Unix and Linux on those sort of computers, but if we're talking about just Windows and PCs, you're going to have a bit of difference of manufacturing, and you're going to come into driver issues perhaps as well. So you may need to do a bit more research into going onto the internet, downloading drivers, keeping your drivers up to date, that sort of thing. While on the Mac front, you're generally going to be all up and running as well. Now, the other thing you've got to consider is, if you do want to run Windows, you can also run that on your Mac as well, right? So the Macs do have a component called Boot Camp. There's also software such as VMware Fusion, and Parallel is another great program that actually lets you run Windows on the Mac as well. So if you're concerned about going to a Mac operating system, and it's all different and you can't run Windows on it, well, you actually can. You can run them both side by side. So that's an advantage of going to the Mac on top of a Windows PC. Is you may be looking at getting, let's say you've got 50 employees in your company, okay? You've got 50 employees and you need to buy them all computers, right? Let's say they're all just going to be doing standard word processing, spreadsheets, surfing the internet, checking their emails, that sort of thing. And you want to buy 50 computers for your staff. Now, Windows, Mac, you're going to find very difference in price between the two. I buy a Dell computer, I could maybe spend about $1,000, maybe a little bit less. I could get away with $800 for a pretty decent laptop or a pretty decent desktop. If you want to beef it up in specs, you're going to be paying a little bit extra, of course, maybe up to $1,500. For an equivalent thing on the Mac, for a laptop, you may be looking up to about $1,500 to $2,000 or even more for an equivalent sort of computer, which does potentially the same thing if it's just going to be for standard word processing, spreadsheets, surfing the internet, checking your emails. So in that sense, you've got to think about if you're looking at that figure of the price from a Windows to a Mac multiplied by the amount of staff in your company, you're going to be spending a lot more for the Mac than you would on the Windows. So you've got to always consider those two things there as well. That Windows has been around for a long time, so has Apple, but Windows got traction a lot sooner, right? It's got a much bigger following, so a lot more people are familiar with Windows. So you may be tempted to go and rush and get your Windows computers because generally people will be more familiar with the software. So that could be a consideration with you purchasing a PC running Windows, is that it's more familiar, you know the software, you know how to run it, you know your Windows Explorer, you know your Internet Explorer, you know your control panel, that sort of thing. So maybe more familiar to you, so you may want to go down that route. While the Mac may be a little bit newer, a little bit different, you've got a different sort of setup, you've got system preferences instead of your control panel, you've got things like an alias instead of shortcuts. There's certain things that are slightly different. On the Mac, you've got a Finder. On Windows, you've got Windows Explorer. So there's slightly differences between the two. But what you'll generally find is in statistics, you'll find that people who are not very familiar with computers at all, that they'll find a Mac much easier to adapt to than a Windows. So let's say somebody's never used a computer. A Mac computer is generally more user-friendly. It's a lot more simple to sort of grasp it than a Windows computer would be. On the other hand, if you've been using Macs all your life and you want to get a Windows computer, you may find that more difficult to make the transition from Mac to Windows as you would making a transition from Windows to Mac. All right, so if you've got a lot of people running Windows, if you're running Windows and you get a Mac, people can more likely transition much easier into the Mac front as well. So the one thing that people go for when they go for Macs is generally the look of the computer. Macs generally look better, right? There's a lot of cool looking PCs out there as well. There's a lot of newer models of PCs, of laptops that are starting to look really, really slick. My personal opinion is they're just copying the Mac model. They're making them look like Macs. But Apple has generally got a very good design. They've got a good team of designers that work at Apple that strive to make the computers look really good, really slick. So that's something you've got to consider. So if you're thinking of a place where you've got, say, a reception desk, something like that, you may want to consider getting a Mac for your reception. Something that's going to be visually appealing for people that say come in, for customers, that sort of thing, that come into your business. Looks do impress. So getting the Macs out there can show a bit of a higher level of professionalism and can make the computer just look a little bit slicker and a little bit smarter as well. So if you're concerned about software, don't be concerned about the software. Windows and PCs and the Macs have been around for a good amount of time. The Macs have been growing a lot more. So ever since the iPhone and the iPad came out and they became a lot more popular, even before that when the iPods first came out in the early 2000s, Apple started getting a lot more traction, right? So the market share grew a lot. So a lot of the developers that were writing apps specifically for Windows started also writing them for Macs as well. So you'll generally find that a lot of apps that are available for Windows, you can also get them for Mac as well. That's not true for everything, but a lot of them are now cross-compatible, right? The same way there are certain apps for Mac that you can't get onto Windows, all right? So just consider that as well. If you want Microsoft Office, it's available for both, right? If you want Google Chrome, it's available for both. So there's a lot of apps that are available for both the Windows and the Mac front. Now, what we described before as well is that the Macs do allow you to install Windows onto them as well. So you can do a dual boot option and actually run your Windows and your Mac together on the same computer. If you have those concerns where there's a particular app that cannot run on Windows, you can, that cannot run on Mac, you can still install it on the Windows installation of the Mac side as well. So don't be too concerned about software. What I would recommend is do your research beforehand. Look at your existing computer. If you say you're wanting to do a switch from a Windows to a Mac or a Mac to a Windows, do a quick Google search. Look at all the apps that you've currently got installed and see if there's an equivalent or the same sort of application available for the other platform. So if we're talking about in a business sense and you're wanting to put Macs onto a network, for example, you're going to find that generally Macs can be a little bit more difficult for certain things on the network than a Windows computer. All right. If we're talking to tech talk, all right, if we're going into the technology behind, this may not be relevant to you, but a lot of the IT guys will work with things like Active Directory and binding the computers into the domain and doing all that sort of stuff. Windows can be generally easier to manage than a Mac. Macs do have all the tools to be able to talk to a Microsoft AD environment, so to talk to the same servers, but you may find that things like file sharing, the formats of files, that sort of stuff, your SMB shares, sharing with file servers, sharing with things like DFS, and so sort of all IT technical terms can be a little bit harder to manage Mac computers on a corporate network than on a Windows running on a corporate network. Things like remote management. So a lot of companies manage your computer fleets remotely. So you can log into your computers, you can manage them remotely, you can control the screens, that sort of thing. Can be a bit more difficult to manage. Let's say you've got 50 Windows computers and 3 or 4 Mac computers in your business. Generally the Windows tools cannot manage the Mac tools very easily. So you may need to get specific Mac tools to be able to manage your Mac fleet. So just keep that in mind. But generally you can get past with both of them and they'll work pretty well on the network. Just the Macs, you have to have a few guys that just know what they're doing, know where to look on the Mac to be able to connect them correctly into the network, give them the IP addresses, all that sort of stuff, and you should be good to go. So if you're looking at things like zip files, movie files, image files, those sort of things, they're pretty much standard between the two. So if you've got a JPEG file, you can open it on a Windows or on a Mac computer. Right? If you've got a HTML file like a website, you can open up on a Windows or on a Mac computer. A text file on a Windows or on a Mac computer. If you've got Microsoft Office spreadsheets, if you've got Word documents, as long as you've got Microsoft Office installed on the Mac or on the Windows, which you can install for both, you can open up .doc files and .xls files as well. So spreadsheets, you can open up between the two platforms. Things you may find differently is, for example, a executable file. So on the Windows front, you've got what's called an exe file, an exe file, which you can open and that will install a program or run a program on your computer. While on the Mac, you've got an equivalent would be something like a DMG file. So you can't open up a DMG file in Windows natively. You can't open up an exe file, an exe file on the Mac. So they're the two things that are slightly different. You may find that the format of how programs are installed on Windows and Mac is slightly different. So when you install an app on Windows, you go in, you double click on the installer, you follow the prompts and you install the app, right? And then you go into your Windows Explorer, you open up your program files, and then in there you've got your folder, right? Let's say you've just installed Google Chrome. You open up Google Chrome, you've got the Google Chrome exe to open up the file, but then you've got all the other files, the DLL files and all these inf files and all the configuration stuff within the folder of Google Chrome. All right, so it's all scattered within the one folder. The good thing about on the Mac side is it groups them all up together into a package, is what they call it. So you're essentially seeing inside your Finder under the applications area, all you're seeing is Google Chrome. All right. Not knowing that obviously within that you've got all these other files that are sort of hidden from the view. So they've done this essentially so that people who don't need to know what DLL files are, most people don't need to know about all these configuration files, it's all sort of hidden on the Mac. So the Mac just makes it a little bit easier. Just double click on the files, you've got all the stuff there, you just open up the files as normal, while Windows can be a little bit more technical, if that's the right term to use. So on the Windows environment, you've got things like FAT32 and NTFS is the file formats. On the Mac front, you can also read and write FAT32. You can read NTFS, and there's also other formats called macOS, extendable, right? File formats as well. So these are separate file formats. So if you've got a macOS extendable file format formatted on your on a USB stick, for example, and you grab that disk and you put it into a Windows computer, you won't be able to read it. You plug a Mac formatted disk into a Windows computer, and the Windows will actually say, you need to format this drive. I don't know what this is, so you won't be able to open it, okay? Likewise, if you format a USB stick on Windows as an NTFS, and you plug it into a Mac, the Mac will be able to read it, and you'll be able to copy data off it, but you can't write any new data to it. All right, this is with NTFS. With FAT32, you'll find both ways. But there are ways to get around this, and you can read both formats across Windows and Mac with additional software and plugins and that sort of thing. But keep in mind that you've got certain limitations when it comes to actual format of files on external media, for example. So if you're looking at getting, say, a desktop for a Windows or a desktop for a Mac, the Macs are generally going to be a bit harder to expand. Right? Now what I mean by expand is if I want to add a bigger hard drive, right? If I want to change some components inside of it, it's going to be a lot more difficult than doing it on a Windows machine. Windows machine, I've got an 80 gig hard drive, I want to go down to the shop and buy a 200 gig hard drive, I can open it up, put it in, no problems. Very easy. You don't have to be a super technical guy to know how to open it up, unplug it, pull it out, put the new one in. Mac, slightly more difficult. You've got to go on YouTube, find a video on how to actually open it. Can be a little bit more tricky. RAM generally is pretty easy on a Mac, but things like hard drives, those sort of things can be a little bit more difficult. So if you want to expand if you want to change a CD drive, put in a Blu-ray drive instead of the DVD drive, you can't really do that as easily on a Mac than you could on a Windows desktop, for example. Okay. Something you've got to consider on Windows is viruses, spam, malware, those sort of things. Now, yes, those things do exist on the Macs as well, so I don't think that the Macs are perfect and they're never going to get a virus, they're never going to get anything like that, but they're less prone to get infected than a Windows machine. Now, that could be because Windows is a much bigger market share, so there's a lot more hackers and developers and everything writing malware and viruses to infect Windows because the majority of the world is running Windows. But the Macs generally are a stronger back end. So Macs run what's called Unix. So Unix generally is built a little bit stronger and has much better features in terms of security and those sort of things than a Windows machine would. There are antivirus spam sort of software available for both Windows and for Mac, so you can install them on both Windows and Mac, so you can be protected either way. But just keep in mind that Windows generally is more susceptible to be catching viruses, to be infected by malware, those sort of things, than a Mac computer. So in a business context, if you're looking at, say, getting things like laptops, one thing you've got to consider as well is a lot of businesses will use what are called docks, right? So for laptops, you would grab your laptop and you just place it on a dock. That dock would remain on your desk, and you'd have all your connectors plugged into that. So the power, your USB, your monitor, all that sort of stuff, right? Your keyboard, your mouse, everything plugged into the dock itself. You would go home, you take the laptop with you, you come in the morning, you put the laptop on the dock, and you're good to go. You don't have to go and plug everything on the side. That isn't really available on the Mac side, right? So consider that as well, that for Windows, you've got the flexibility of having docks, while you don't have that flexibility on the laptop front for the Macs. There are, again, as I said, there are equivalents. You can do similar things, and the newer screens can have those sort of docks via a Thunderbolt connector, those sort of things. But the ease of use of just plugging it into a dock is not as seamless as it is on the Windows, on the PC front. So that is it. I hope you found this helpful. So as I said, there is slight differences between the Windows and the Mac front. Both have got pros and cons in my opinion, depending on what you want to do, depending on how you want to use it, what you want to achieve from it. You can go either way. So give me a thumbs up, subscribe to Digital by Computing as well for a whole bunch of more videos. Thanks for watching.